Hi everybody! Today I received my first shipment of author copies of my book. So exciting! I made a separate little video of me opening the box, and since I was here I thought I would do another video and talk to you guys about relationships, attachment styles, and why my novel Awakening Hearts, A Tale of Love Across Lifetimes, even though it is a love story, is not actually a romance. So something I've learned in the last year or two that I was not aware of before is that in order for a book to be categorized as a romance, it has to have a happy ever after ending. And what I've come to find out is that readers will seek out very specific genres for very specific reasons, and they will have expectations around the kind of story and the kind of plot development and the kind of ending that comes with that genre. So if you market your book as a romance, it better have a happy after ending, or you're going to have some very dissatisfied readers. So my book is not a romance. My book is women's fiction, lesbian fiction, not lesbian romance, because it's a little bit different. It's more about deep, powerful soulmate relationships that have that, similarly as in some of the romance novels that you may know and love, there is that powerful instant attraction and sense of recognition between the main characters. However, in my book, there's an exploration of how that kind of attraction can be a catalyst for change in your life. Not just change of outer circumstances, but a deep, lasting change on the inner level. And so I think that the types of readers who are going to most resonate with my book, my characters, my story, are the ones who also have that desire, that drive to take their life circumstances, whether it's relationship or otherwise, and transform them into fertilizer for growth in their life. So whether it be positive or perceived negative circumstances, to have that ability to see these outer impeti, I guess it's a plural for impetus, as an opportunity to go deeper within ourselves. And so ultimately, my book is an invitation to go deeper within ourselves as my characters are taking their own inner journey that is set into motion by outer circumstances and by their meeting. And this type of attraction and connection that I call a soulmate connection, like the first line of my book says, soulmate love is the most transformative and by far the most thrilling, but also the most challenging. It will often push us outside of our comfort zone. It will challenge us, and it will make us re-examine our beliefs and our views of the world and our ideas about ourselves. So I hope that makes sense. To make a long story short, that's how my book is different from your typical romance, but I don't think it can be really categorized in a black and white way, because every romance has so many nuances too. But that said, I believe that Awakening Hearts has a very positive, very hopeful, very optimistic ending. It's just not your typical right off into the sunset together and live happily ever after. So it's a little bit different in that respect. So the other thing I wanted to talk to you guys about is attachment styles. And some of you may be familiar with the concept of adult attachment styles and the research that has been done to show how these attachment styles that form in our very early years, when we're infants and small children, can inform our adult relationships and affect us many years into our lives. I've learned a lot about attachment styles over the past 4.5 years, maybe. And I want to give a shout out to Neil Sattin here and his fabulous podcast called Relationship Alive. I discovered Neil's work in, I think it was early 2017, and started devouring all of his podcast episodes. I learned so much from him and all his amazing guests that he interviewed. And there were some episodes in particular that spoke to attachment style that for me just explained so much and helped me understand myself better and the dynamics in some of the relationships that I've been in. And so it's been super fascinating. And there are a couple of experts in particular that he interviewed that I learned so much from. And one of them is Stan Takin, who wrote this book called Wired for Love. How understanding your partner's brain and attachment style can help you diffuse conflict and build a secure relationship. And the other one is Dr. Sue Johnson, Hold Me Tight, 7 Conversations for a Lifetime of Love. Neil has actually done multiple interviews with both of these authors that are all fantastic, and I highly encourage you to visit his website at neilsattin.com, neilsattin.com, and from there you can go to his podcast and look up these names and you'll find all those episodes. I will also link to those in my notes below, and I'll create a resource page on my website where you can go and find all of those links. So the work that Dr. Sue Johnson and Stan Takin present is based on the work of a British researcher, John Bowlby, in the 1970s. And he did research with children. He put young children in a room with their primary caretaker, which at the time was usually their mother. And for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to refer to their mother. And he had them playing, and then at some point he had the mother leave the room, and he would observe how these young children would respond. And in addition to observing their outer demeanor, he also measured physiological signs of stress. So perspiration, increase in heart rate, dilation of the pupils. And so between the outer signs and the measurable signs, he looked at how they responded. So what he found was that there were 3 major different attachment styles. There are actually a few other sub-nuances, but for simplicity's sake, we're going to stick with those 3 major attachment types right now. And one of them is secure. And then there are 2 major insecure attachment styles, which are avoidant and anxious. Actually, Stan Takin uses a different wording for those, which I really appreciate. He calls them islands and waves. So the islands are the ones that tend to be more independent and do their own thing, and the waves are the ones that will come toward you more and reach out and want more connection and want more communication. We'll get back around to that in a moment. But back to the research that John Bowlby did with the young children. For the securely attached children, what he observed was that when their mother left the room, they would take notice, they would interrupt their playtime, and maybe be a little bit upset, but then they would go back to playing and they'd be fine. And then when the mother came back into the room, again, they would interrupt their playing, they would acknowledge her, but then before long, they would go back to playing and they'd be quite content. No major signs of distress. Then we have the anxious attachment style, and the young children who exhibited that attachment style, when the mother would leave the room, they would show clear signs of distress, both outwardly and inwardly with the measurable signs. They might throw a temper tantrum. It would take them a while to calm down. Eventually, they would go back to playing. And then when the mother would come back in, they might be excited to see the mother, but at the same time, they were also upset because in their mind, they already know the mother is going to leave them again. So they're already upset because, yay, you're back, but I know you're going to abandon me again. So I'm already upset about that. And then the third type is the avoidant type, and the children with that attachment style, what John Bowlby noticed was that outwardly they showed very little sign of distress when the mother left the room. In fact, they didn't seem to care. However, physiologically, they did show signs of distress. So they were not letting on to being upset. Unlike the secure children, once they calmed down, they were fine. But the avoidant children actually were quite upset and were quite riled up, but they would not let on to it. And same thing when the mother came back into the room. So those are then the children as adults who pride themselves in their independence, who are usually very strong individuals who have done quite well for themselves in their lives and have developed strong coping mechanisms. However, that was a little bit of a survival mechanism, not just because they wanted to, but because they didn't necessarily have the kind of support that they would have craved, and they didn't have someone who was attentive to them or acknowledged them, or that they could go to with their problems. So they learned very early on to solve their own problems and to be strong within themselves. And so for these children as adults, anything that threatens their independence is seen as a major threat. And that's not necessarily even consciously, but that's like a deeply ingrained type of response, a body response. So if they're in a relationship with an anxious partner that Stan Takin would call a wave, that maybe will come into their space a little bit more than they're comfortable with, that can be quite a trigger for them. And so they're the ones that you might see, taking off to go camping alone for the weekend, or go off on a long run, or they need to go clear their head and they need to be alone in their head to work out their own issues. Whereas the anxious individual will tend to want to talk out their problems, and that can be challenging when they have a partner who's avoidant, who's very much self-sufficient and independent, and doesn't feel that need to talk everything through. The anxious individual often had a primary caretaker who was intermittently available for them. So sometimes they had their needs acknowledged and other times they didn't. And so there is this kind of ingrained fear of, I need to kind of grasp on to make sure that you're going to be available for me because I can't be sure that you will. And there's a very primal survival mechanism that gets triggered. In this case, going back to infancy, if your parent is not available to fulfill your basic needs, to feed you, to change your diaper, to keep you warm, you might die, right? And equally for the avoidant person, if someone encroaches into their space too much, it triggers a very primal survival fear for them too. But in their case, they have been so conditioned that they alone are responsible for their survival and they cannot depend on anybody else. So showing too much vulnerability is for them what would feel like a, this might threaten their survival kind of thing. And then the last thing to mention here is that we are all on a spectrum. So while we usually tend more to one end or the other end of the spectrum, we can, in different relationships, can trigger different attachment styles within us. So you might have found in your life that you've had relationships where you were more the pursuer, let's say, where the other person was more independent and doing their thing, and you were trying to kind of, rope them in and get more of their attention, get more of their time. And you might have had some relationships where the other person wanted a lot of togetherness, a lot of your time and attention, and maybe that felt like a little bit much for you. So you were like, I kind of need my own space a little bit more. So different relationships may trigger different aspects in you. And as you think back on your own life, you may find that you have at times been the more avoidant partner and at times the more anxious partner. So there's, we can definitely exhibit both. And one last thing worth mentioning, I don't think I've said that before, but forgive me if I did, is that according to Stan Takin, the goal is not for all of us to become secure. The goal is to understand our attachment styles so that we can better take care of our needs and our partner's needs. And that being said, he also makes it a point to say that these insecure attachment styles are not pathologies, they're cultural adaptations, meaning that we have developed them as survival mechanisms to keep ourselves safe and to keep ourselves functioning as best as we can. So I hope that gave you a little introduction into the different attachment styles if you aren't familiar with them already. And it may come as no surprise to you then that one of the characters in my book is more on the avoidant end of the spectrum and the other one is more on the anxious end of the spectrum. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a glimpse of a dynamic between Sage and Alex while they're out for a hike. This is still early on in their budding friendship, and the passage that I chose has not only the interaction between the two women but also a beautiful nature scene that I really enjoy, and those nature scenes are actually some of my favorite parts of the book, because when I wrote them and when I reread them, for me it's like a little mini vacation into nature. So hopefully you will feel that way as well. And as you listen to me, maybe just kind of listen in for those subtleties in the way that these two characters interact with each other, what their needs are, what their expectations are from one another, and maybe you'll recognize aspects of yourself or some of your relationships in that as well. So I'm going to share with you my really awesome bookmark, which is a card that my 5-year-old nephew made for me as a congratulations for my book release. That's a steam train, a sun, and a flower. And it really warmed my heart. I was quite impressed with that. So it gets to live in a special place in my very first book that I received. So Sage and Alex are out for a hike in the redwoods. They stopped at a small clearing, leaving the trail to step onto a pebbly beach. Sage looked out over the water. I love the peacefulness of this place. She took a deep breath, stuffing her hands into the pockets of her shorts, closing her eyes against the sunshine. A smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. I love the earthy fragrance of the forest. I always feel so rejuvenated when I spend time in the woods, in body, mind, and spirit. Alex followed her gaze out over the water. I know what you mean. They both stood in silence for a while, watching the sun reflect off the moving river's surface, making it glimmer as if covered with a million sparkling diamonds. The rushing sound of the water and the wind in the branches of the trees had an almost hypnotic effect on both of them. A sense of timelessness enveloped them, and Sage found herself wishing she could remain there for eternity. It was a rare morsel of bliss. She knew she'd have to come down from the moment's magic eventually, but for the time being, she let herself get lost in it, allowing herself to drift and feel the buoyancy of it a little longer. Until at last, reality called her back. Alex must have equally drifted elsewhere, the wistful expression on her face indicating she was caught in her own distant reverie. Sage refrained from speaking for a while, not wanting to pull her out of the moment. She thought again about Lizzie and Claudia, wondering how Alex would respond if she told her about her vision. Several serene minutes later, she broke the silence. Penny for your thoughts? Alex turned slowly toward Sage, looking dazed and drowsy. It was the same look Sage's massage clients had after their sessions. Sage smiled, her heart contracting at the sight. I was just wondering what you were thinking about. Seemed like you were somewhere far away. Oh, Alex came gradually back to her earthly senses. I was thinking about my dog Shadow. Her eyes glazed over. We used to go on a lot of hikes together, he and I. Sage's chest tightened. She could feel Alex's sadness. She'd always felt others' emotions in her body, sometimes to her detriment, and she'd worked hard on creating better energetic boundaries, especially in her workplace. But she felt Alex's pain particularly strongly, as if her loss were Sage's own. Alex's demeanor changed quickly, as though she'd caught herself in letting down her guard and showing too much vulnerability. How about that vista point you mentioned? She turned away from the water and took a few long strides to rejoin the path. Let's go. I want to see the bay. Waving Sage over, she jogged on the spot, leaving no doubt as to her eagerness to keep moving. Moving towards something that excited her, sure, but it seemed to Sage also away from something she'd rather not unearth. Sage struggled to keep up with the abrupt change of pace. Just minutes earlier, both of them had been floating in another realm, a dreamy dimension. Witnessing Alex in a moment of rawness had activated something in Sage. Her strength, and possibly her favorite thing in life, was holding space for others as they revealed the depths of their authentic selves, letting themselves be vulnerable. Alex had almost gone there with her. If not in words, still she'd let Sage see a glimpse of her inner world, her unadulterated feelings. Sage had been ready to delve deep with her, but Alex was already on to the next action step. Come on, Sage, the trail is waiting. More like you're waiting. I don't think the trail's in any hurry, she muttered the words under her breath. Picking up her sling pack, she took a swig of water from her bottle before securing it in a side pocket, then swung the pack over her shoulder. Wet? Alex hadn't heard her, nor had Sage intended her to. Just said I was coming. She tried to match her energy to Alex's, but against her best efforts, she couldn't conjure the same enthusiasm. She was still in a different energetic space. Sage did her best to keep up with Alex's quickened pace. She didn't mind a vigorous hike, but the sudden urgency felt a bit jarring. So there you have it. And hope you enjoyed today's little reading, and that there was some food for thought in my little talk about the attachment styles. And if you want to learn more, by all means, check out Neil Sattin's podcast, check out Stan Takin, Dr. Sue Johnson. There's another excellent book that's called Attached, but I do not remember the authors offhand. I'll also look that up and put that in the resource section on my website. So I hope this was interesting for you. This was a little bit of a long video today. If you stuck with me all the way until the end, thank you so much for spending this time with me, and I look forward to seeing you again next time.